Something we shouldn't be celebrating is inflation. And Madam President, I wasn't invited, but it looks like there was one heck of a party this week at the White House. In case folks missed it, President Biden, Majority Leader Schumer, Speaker Pelosi, and others gathered on the south lawn of the White House on Tuesday afternoon to clink champagne glasses and celebrate the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, passed along straight party lines last month. James Taylor even flew in for the festivities. But at the same time that Washington politicians were patting themselves on the back, here's actual reality. Not Orwellian rhetoric, not sort of made up names for legislation to spend hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. Here's actual reality. Americans are getting slapped in the face with yet another month of bad news. Core inflation grew another 0.6% just in the month of August, defying even the most pessimistic estimations and analyses heading into those reporting numbers. Both the Dow and the S&P had their worst days since the very arrival of COVID. Consumer prices are now up 8.3% for the year, but it's worse than that for median income households in America. Grocery prices are 13% more expensive this middle of September than they were the last middle of September. How do you think about what 13% inflation looks like? Here's the way I explained it to my kids. If a year ago today, you went to the grocery store checkout line and you had $100 in your pocket and you had a cart full of groceries and you paid your $100 for the $100 of groceries, if you showed up today at the checkout line at the grocery store with the exact same cart and the exact same $100, you'd then have to awkwardly, in an embarrassed way, in front of the people behind you in line, say, I got to figure out how to take $13 of stuff off this checkout line, because the $13 that I had, the $100 that I had last year that bought $100 of food, only buys $87 of food right now. That's what 13% inflation means. Even CNN had to admit that the White House's timing was awkward, calling the event, quote, a bizarre split-screen moment, close quote, with President Biden taking a victory lap with his so-called Inflation Reduction Act, while in the real world, inflation was tanking markets. That was actually what was happening on Tuesday. On air, the CNN anchor suggested, quote, it feels a little hard to be celebratory, close quote. That's a kind of awkward, timid way to tell the truth. Lots of Americans have become used to this split-screen reality, where Washington says one thing, but reality is completely different. It often feels like officials in Washington are living alternate realities and then trying to convince the American people, you don't know what you're talking about. What you're actually experiencing at the checkout line when you had to put back $13 of groceries, it's not really true. The great news is we got wine glasses in our hands, let's clink them together. Washington, D.C. is obviously in a bubble, and not for the first time. The same folks who threw that party are the types who order lots of their food from DoorDash and therefore might actually not know what the price of eggs, milk, and meat are. They're the kind of folks who see inflation as something that happens on paper. But seeing it on paper is different than feeling it. DC sees many problems on paper, but doesn't really connect with what the American people are living. DC saw the housing crisis of 2008-9 as something on paper, not as reality. Why? Well, because 5 of the 7 richest counties in America are the 5 suburban counties of Northern Virginia and Maryland that ring Washington, D.C. Think about that. Of 3,000 counties in America, 5 of the 7 richest ones are the places that surround this city. So in 2008-9, when housing was collapsing everywhere, when lots of people were going bankrupt in the country, people in this city said, I don't know what the heck you're talking about. We got massive demand. Houses sell with escalator clauses. There are way more buyers than there are sellers. And so housing prices in Washington, D.C., in Northern Virginia, and in suburban Maryland went up, even as the country was living that collapse. Opioids is a crisis that a lot of people in Washington, D.C. know only on paper because they don't see it around the yuppifying neighborhoods of Washington, D.C. Inflation is now that kind of crisis. It is a very real thing, and yet people in this city host white wine parties to talk about how great it is that passing legislation that spent hundreds of billions of dollars more accelerating inflation, and they decided they'd name it the Inflation Reduction Act. Let's review a little bit of history about what we've learned about inflation over the last 15 months. More than a year ago, last summer, when Americans were already feeling their prices creep higher, the president dismissed long-term worries about inflation with this quote: There's nobody suggesting there's any unchecked inflation on the way. No serious economist, close quote. What? That was an incredibly bizarre, dishonest statement, and everyone knew when it was spoken, when speechwriters wrote it, they knew that that wasn't true. Why did they know? Well, because inflation had gone from 1.4 to 5.5% in the 3 months before that statement was uttered. Larry Summers, longtime Democratic economist across multiple administrations, well-respected by folks in academia and in government and in both parties, was screaming at the White House, not just in private, but in public, that this was nonsense. They were delusional about what was happening with inflation numbers, and yet our president said there's nobody suggesting that unchecked inflation is on the way, no serious economist. Here's what was actually happening in White House meeting rooms at that time. Half of the Obama economic team was coming in telling the Biden economic team, hey, you guys are going to get caught with your pants down. That isn't true. That spin isn't reality, and inflation is big, it is bad, and it is growing. And yet speechwriters said, let's have the president go out to the podium and say there's no serious economist who believes inflation's coming. That was July of 2021. February of this year, when inflation had hit 7.8%, our president predicted, quote, inflation ought to be able to start tapering off as we go through this year, close quote. He then predicted in December that inflation had already peaked. Every one of these comments was detached from reality, and the people writing the speeches knew they were detached from reality. The president's obviously not the only offender. Last October, with high prices already eating away at family savings accounts, the White House Chief of Staff, Ron Klain, applauded a tweet describing inflation and supply chain snarls as, quote, high-class problems, close quote. That's some white wine drunk commentary for you. This is a middle-class American problem that families in all 50 states are suffering. A week later, the White House press secretary shrugged off the same problem when asked about inflation as, quote, the tragedy of a treadmill that's delayed. The tragedy of a treadmill that's delayed. Ouch. Do these people know anyone in America who's ever had to put stuff back at the checkout line at the grocery store? Because that's what I experience and see at Walmart and Hy-Vee right now in Fremont, Nebraska. Have they ever sat down with people who compare their receipts week over week or month over month? Those people looking at their receipts, knowing that they had to put stuff back, they're not wrong, and they're not talking about a 3-month delay on a Peloton delivery. Just 2 months later, another White House press secretary declared that the U.S. is, quote, stronger economically than we have ever been in our history. That's what was said at the White House podium. Stronger economically than we've ever been in our history. Totally drunk stuff. According to Gallup poll, 56% of Americans now say price increases are causing financial hardship for their families. That's up from 49% a couple months ago and 45% the previous fall. According to a Monmouth poll, nearly 9 out of 10 Americans say the country is on the wrong track. But the White House is throwing wine and cheese parties to celebrate the Inflation Reduction Act. Americans have watched the president announce that he plans to force non-college graduates in Scottsbluff, Nebraska and Beckley, West Virginia to pay for the debt burden of people with masters and PhDs in Berkeley and Bethesda. Let's be clear, 56% of all the student loan debt in America is held by people with graduate degrees. The majority of college loan debt in America is held by people with graduate degrees. About a third of Americans go to college. But what we should do, Washington says, is take money from non-college graduates and give it to folks with graduate degrees, and then let's claim it's somehow going to reduce the deficit. Drunk stuff. Americans have watched as every basic household necessity has become more expensive, from groceries to gas, and then they hear politicians change the name of their bill to the Inflation Reduction Act and applaud themselves for spending hundreds of billions of dollars of inflationary dollars on the steps of the White House Tuesday afternoon. Folks, this isn't just offensive. It's the kind of behavior, it's the kind of dishonesty that poisons democracy. Politicians are saying things here that are 180 degrees reversed from reality, and that cuts at public trust. It doesn't just matter economically, it matters civically. The relationship between the American people and their leaders is a relationship built on trust, a trust that, when elected officials at their desks in Washington should be taking seriously the needs and desires of their constituents, we have a bunch of people in Washington, D.C. who mistake the Washington, D.C. elite experience, where the income of folks who work for the federal government is substantially higher than the median American. It attacks public trust. Elected officials are not special. Elected officials, quite frankly, are often not that impressive. Elected officials are not demagogues. Public servants are supposed to be serving the public. It is in our job description to trust that the people we represent actually know something about their struggles and their challenges and their day-to-day difficulties making ends meet. It is in our job description to listen to them, to look at their experience and to take it to heart. It's in our job description to think carefully about the challenges they face and the ways we could address those challenges, always with a mindful eye to the direction established by our constitutional order and the best of our democratic traditions. But that relationship is destroyed when Washington, D.C. breaks faith with the American people, when it declares, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what your experience is at the grocery store checkout line. There's no serious inflation. No serious economist thinks inflation's coming. The actual numbers are 13% grocery and 8.5% overall. These are late 1970s kind of numbers. Politicians know best. No, we don't. The relationship is destroyed when self-satisfied appointees and smug bureaucrats in Washington bustle up and down Pennsylvania Avenue, deciding that division is more efficient politics than competent governance. Lectures about the soul of America ring pretty hollow from practitioners of this craven kind of politics of contempt. Americans deserve better. Starting with honesty is a pretty good start. Here's honesty. We have an inflationary crisis on our hands, and the reality is that inflation is making life a lot more difficult, a lot more precarious for millions and millions of our neighbors. Our families and friends are feeling pain at the pump and at the checkout lines. They're watching their savings accounts and pensions be nibbled away. They haven't imagined a hardship. This is reality, experiential and economic reality. The only thing that's misaligned is the rhetoric of this place. And Americans won't be bludgeoned into believing that they're actually thriving when they're experiencing 13% grocery inflation. Things are hard, and the barest minimum this White House could do is admit it, tell the truth, and put away the party hats. The American people are resilient. We're tough. We're not ready to accept this as the new normal. We're going to work our way through this, but we need less condescension and less spin. We need a lot more truth-telling from those in power. We need fewer tone-deaf, wine-glass clinking parties from folks who have escalated inflation with reckless spending and then claimed that the American people are wrong and that this new spending will somehow reduce inflation. Nobody really believes that. And so the folks writing those press releases and those speeches, inviting people to parties at the White House, they should reconsider. They should tell the truth. It's hogwash, and they know it, but more importantly, the American people know it, and we should tell them the truth. Thank you, Madam President.